The moment a powerful man realizes the past has been quietly waiting for him in the lobby is the moment his entire life begins to shift. Monday mornings inside Whitmore Holdings usually moved with the quiet precision of a machine that never made mistakes. The glass tower rose above Midtown Manhattan like a polished blade, catching the gray light of a late autumn sky. Inside, the marble lobby hummed with a rhythm built from expensive shoes crossing the floor, elevator chimes echoing against stone walls, and the low murmur of assistants reciting schedules that stretched hour by hour across digital tablets. At exactly 8:12 a.m., the private elevator door slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, and Ethan Whitmore stepped out carrying the kind of silence that followed men who controlled billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. His suit was charcoal, tailored so precisely it seemed sculpted rather than stitched. His watch reflected the ceiling lights as he checked the time, already calculating the distance between the board meeting upstairs and the international call scheduled 15 minutes later. Most people in the lobby didn't look directly at him. They never did. Power had a way of bending attention without demanding it. But on this particular morning, something unusual waited near the reception desk, something small and quiet that didn't belong among the polished surfaces and carefully measured voices of Whitmore Holdings. A young woman sat on the edge of a leather chair with a manila folder resting in her lap. Her coat was simple, navy blue, worn at the sleeves but clean. Beside her sat 3 children no older than 3 years old, each perched carefully on identical chairs, as if they understood instinctively that this building expected order. Their coats were zipped neatly. Their shoes were lined up straight beneath their feet. One of them swung a tiny leg that barely reached the floor. Ethan might have walked past them like he had passed thousands of visitors before, except for the moment when one of the children lifted his head and looked straight at him. It lasted less than a second. The boy's gaze wasn't curious or frightened. It was simply direct, and Ethan stopped walking. At first he didn't know why. The lobby noise continued around him. The clicking heels, the quiet conversations, the receptionist answering phones. But something in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. The boy had gray eyes. Not the pale gray that sometimes appears in photographs or under bright light. These were storm-colored eyes, steady and sharp, the exact shade that had stared back at Ethan from mirrors his entire life. The child blinked once, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to place the tall stranger standing 10 feet away. Beside him, a little girl leaned forward, resting both hands on her knees with patient seriousness. The third child sat perfectly still, his small fingers gripping the edge of the chair like he had been told not to move until someone said it was okay. Ethan felt the pen in his hand stop mid-movement. He hadn't realized he was still holding it from the documents he'd signed in the elevator. His assistant Marcus, walking 2 steps behind him, nearly collided with his shoulder when Ethan froze. "Sir," Marcus asked quietly, lowering his voice instinctively the way everyone did around Ethan. Ethan didn't answer right away. His attention had shifted completely to the woman sitting beside the 3 children. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was focused on the reception desk, speaking gently to the young receptionist who was explaining something about appointments and application procedures. The woman's voice was calm, careful, the voice of someone who had practiced speaking with dignity even when asking for something difficult. "I understand," she said softly. "I just hope someone might take a look at my resume. I'm available for administrative work, scheduling, or anything temporary. I can start immediately." The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Whitmore Holdings usually hires through formal channels. You would need to apply online. The woman nodded as if she had expected that answer. "I did. Twice. I thought maybe if I came in person." Her sentence trailed off, not because she was embarrassed, but because she didn't want to sound desperate in front of the children sitting beside her. Ethan noticed the folder in her hands then. The corners were worn from being opened and closed too many times. Inside were probably resumes, references, maybe printed applications, paper evidence of someone trying very hard not to give up. One of the children turned again, looking up at Ethan with the same calm curiosity. This time the boy's face tilted toward the light coming through the lobby windows, and Ethan saw it more clearly. The shape of the child's mouth, the faint arch of his eyebrow, a detail so small it would mean nothing to anyone else. But to Ethan, it was like seeing a photograph from his own childhood suddenly step out into the room. The air in the lobby seemed to thin. Marcus followed Ethan's line of sight and frowned slightly, not understanding why his boss had stopped moving. "Sir, the board meeting begins in 8 minutes, he reminded quietly. Ethan still didn't move. Across the room, the woman finally turned her head, sensing the shift in silence behind her. Her eyes met Ethan's for the first time. For a fraction of a second, neither of them spoke. Recognition didn't arrive like lightning. It came slowly, the way memory sometimes does when it has been buried under years of routine and distance. Ethan felt something old stir in his mind, a rain-soaked night, a city blackout, the faint glow of emergency lights in a nearly empty office building years ago. But before the memory could fully form, the smallest child slid carefully off his chair and walked 2 steps toward Ethan. The boy stopped just short of the polished marble floor that marked the entrance to the executive elevator area. He looked up again, studying Ethan with the open seriousness children sometimes carry when they are trying to understand adults. Ethan Whitmore, CEO of one of the most powerful investment firms in the country, felt his breath catch in a way no financial negotiation had ever managed to do. 3 small pairs of eyes looked at him from across the lobby. 3 quiet faces that shared the same calm gravity. And for the first time that morning, Ethan Whitmore forgot completely about the meeting waiting upstairs. The silence in the lobby stretched just long enough for everyone nearby to feel that something had shifted even if they did not know why. Ethan Whitmore stood perfectly still near the executive elevator while the smallest boy studied him with the careful attention children sometimes give to strangers who seem familiar without explanation. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended between 2 ordinary seconds that refused to connect. Then Marcus cleared his throat quietly beside him. "Sir, the board meeting begins in 7 minutes. The reminder drifted through the air like a pebble dropped into still water. Ethan blinked once, as if waking from a thought he had not intended to enter. His eyes moved from the boy to the woman sitting near the reception desk. She had stood up now, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair where the other 2 children still sat. Her posture was straight, protective without looking defensive. When their eyes met again, the recognition that had begun to stir in Ethan's memory deepened slightly, though it was still incomplete, like a photograph half hidden in shadow. The receptionist shifted nervously behind the desk. She was young, new enough to the building that she had not yet learned how to interpret the subtle signals of the executive floor. "Mr. Whitmore," she said cautiously, unsure whether to address the interruption or pretend it had not happened. Ethan stepped forward before she could finish the sentence. The marble floor carried the sound of his shoes across the lobby in slow, deliberate steps. Each movement felt strangely heavy, as if the air itself had thickened around him. The smallest boy remained standing where he was, his tiny coat slightly oversized, his hands tucked inside the pockets the way children sometimes do when they are not sure what adults expect from them. When Ethan reached the edge of the reception area, he crouched slightly so that his height would not tower over the child. He did not say anything immediately. Instead, he studied the boy's face with a quiet intensity that made Marcus glance away out of instinctive respect. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable once seen. The calm eyes, the shape of the chin, the faint crease that appeared between the eyebrows when the boy concentrated. Ethan straightened slowly and turned his attention to the woman again. "You came here looking for work," he said. His voice was steady, but the sentence sounded less like a question than a confirmation of what he had already understood. The woman nodded once. "Yes, I applied online, but I thought it might help to come in person." Her voice carried the soft confidence of someone who had learned to speak carefully in unfamiliar rooms. Ethan glanced briefly at the folder she held. "Your name?" "Nia Brooks," she replied. The name landed somewhere in Ethan's memory and stirred the unfinished echo from earlier. Nia Brooks. The sound of it lingered for a moment before dissolving again into uncertainty. Ethan gestured slightly toward the hallway leading to the executive offices. "Come with me." The receptionist looked startled. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Nia hesitated only long enough to glance down at the children. "Stay close," she told them gently. The 3 of them obeyed immediately, standing from their chairs and moving beside her with quiet discipline. As they followed Ethan through the wide glass corridor that led deeper into Whitmore Holdings, employees at nearby desks paused in subtle curiosity. It was not common for the chief executive officer to escort visitors personally through the executive wing, and it was even less common for those visitors to include 3 small children whose shoes tapped lightly against the polished floor. Ethan led them into a smaller conference room overlooking the city. The space was simple compared to the grand boardroom upstairs, but the view through the tall windows stretched across blocks of Manhattan, where morning traffic moved like slow currents of light between buildings. Ethan closed the door behind them. The sound of it clicking shut felt final in a way that separated the room from the rest of the tower. Nia guided the children toward the chairs along the wall. They climbed up carefully, sitting side by side the way they had in the lobby, their small coats rustling softly. One of them leaned toward the window, fascinated by the height of the view. Ethan remained standing near the table for a moment before finally sitting down across from Nia. He placed his pen on the table without realizing he had still been holding it. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the room carried a different weight than the silence in the lobby. This silence felt more personal, like a conversation waiting for the first honest word. Ethan folded his hands together slowly. "You came to ask for a job," he said again, this time more thoughtfully. Nia nodded. "Yes. Administrative work? Anything stable. Scheduling, office support, reception. I have experience organizing event logistics and managing records." Her voice remained composed, but Ethan noticed the faint tension in her shoulders, the kind that appears when someone is trying very hard not to reveal how important the answer might be. One of the children swung his feet lightly against the chair. The motion drew Ethan's attention again, and the strange sense of familiarity returned with quiet persistence. Ethan looked back at Nia. "You brought them with you. Daycare opens later." "This morning," she explained calmly. "I did not want to miss the chance to come here." The answer was simple, but it carried a truth that lingered in the room. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation. Outside the window, a helicopter crossed the skyline, its distant hum barely audible through the thick glass. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her face more carefully now. "How old are they?" Nia glanced toward the children. 3. The word seemed to echo inside Ethan's thoughts for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. 3 years. Something deep in his memory shifted again, like a door beginning to open after being locked for too long. He did not say anything immediately. Instead, he allowed the quiet to settle again while he considered the question forming in his mind, a question that felt too large for the calm atmosphere of the room. Finally, he looked toward the children once more. The boy who had approached him in the lobby met his gaze without hesitation. Ethan Whitmore felt the same tightening in his chest return, stronger now, impossible to ignore. When he spoke again, his voice remained measured, but there was a subtle gravity beneath the words that had not been there before. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, "before we talk about employment, there is something I need to understand." Nia watched him steadily, already sensing that the conversation was about to shift into territory neither of them had expected when the morning began. The quiet inside the conference room seemed to deepen after Ethan spoke, as if the city beyond the tall windows had pulled a little farther away. The children continued sitting along the wall, their small shoes barely brushing the carpet as they looked around with the calm patience of children who had learned how to wait in adult spaces. One of them pressed his palm gently against the glass window, fascinated by the view nearly 40 floors above the street where taxis and buses moved like tiny yellow and silver pieces across the avenues. Ethan Whitmore remained seated across the table from Nia Brooks, his hands loosely folded in front of him, though the stillness of his posture carried a weight that had nothing to do with calm. For years he had built a reputation on clarity. Numbers behaved logically. Contracts could be negotiated. Markets could be predicted within ranges of risk and probability. Yet the 3 small figures sitting along the wall had introduced a kind of uncertainty that did not fit into any model he had ever studied. Ethan looked toward them again, letting the silence linger for one more moment before returning his attention to Nia. When he spoke, his voice remained even, but the question beneath it carried more gravity than any business inquiry he had made that morning. "You said they are 3 years old." Nia nodded once. "Yes." Ethan paused again, his gaze drifting briefly toward the children, as if confirming the detail against what he saw in front of him. The smallest boy had climbed back onto his chair, and was now whispering something quietly to his sister, who listened with serious concentration before nodding as if whatever he had said made perfect sense. Ethan returned his attention to Nia. And their father? The question settled into the room with deliberate softness. It was not an accusation. It was not even confrontational. But it was the first moment since they had entered the conference room that the conversation shifted away from employment and toward the quiet tension that had been building beneath every word. Nia did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the children for a moment, watching them the way a mother does when she is measuring how much of the world they can hear. The three of them remained absorbed in their small observations of the room, unaware that the conversation across the table was about to reach the center of a truth that had remained unspoken for years. Nia turned back toward Ethan slowly. Her expression did not carry anger or embarrassment. If anything, it carried a calm that felt deliberate, the calm of someone who had spent a long time deciding which truths were worth explaining and which were simply facts that existed whether anyone understood them or not. Their father does not know about them, she said quietly. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again. The answer was simple, but it echoed in a way that made the room feel smaller. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Does not know, he repeated carefully, as if testing the exact shape of the phrase. Nia nodded. That is correct. Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly in thought, not with suspicion, but with the kind of focus he applied when piecing together information that did not yet form a clear picture. You never told him. Nia held his gaze. I tried. The words were spoken without drama, yet they carried the weight of something older than the morning that had brought them here. Ethan remained still. What does that mean? Nia opened the folder in front of her slowly, not to show him documents, but as if the motion helped organize the memories she was about to speak aloud. The children continued sitting along the wall, now whispering quietly among themselves about the helicopters that occasionally crossed the skyline outside the window. Nia spoke carefully, her voice steady and measured. 3 years ago, I worked as a temporary event coordinator for a foundation gala held in this building. Ethan's thoughts moved quickly through his memory. Whitmore Holdings hosted several charity events each year, but one particular evening surfaced more clearly than the others. A severe thunderstorm had swept across the city that night. Power outages had spread across several blocks, forcing most of the building to close early while emergency lighting guided guests safely out. Ethan remembered staying behind long after the crowd had left, reviewing final reports, and speaking with the last staff members who remained to ensure everything was secure before the building shut down completely. His gaze returned to Nia with renewed intensity. The storm, he said quietly. Nia nodded once. Yes. The memory sharpened inside Ethan's mind. Rain striking the windows in steady sheets. Emergency lights casting dim reflections across the polished floors. A handful of staff members finishing their work while waiting for the storm to pass. And among them, a young coordinator who had stayed behind to help organize transportation for volunteers who could not reach the subway because the streets had flooded in several places. Ethan remembered the conversation that had followed. It had not been long, and it had not been dramatic. It had simply been two people talking honestly in a quiet building while the city outside struggled through the storm. He had asked about her work. She had explained how she managed logistics for nonprofit events across the city. They had shared coffee from a small break room while waiting for confirmation that the elevators were operating normally again. It had been an ordinary moment by most measures, but something about the quiet honesty of that conversation had remained in Ethan's memory longer than he had expected. Now, sitting across from her 3 years later, the final pieces of that memory slid into place. Ethan exhaled slowly. That was you, he said. Nia gave a small nod. The children along the wall had begun counting the passing helicopters, holding up fingers each time another one appeared in the distance. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing the realization with a calm that only partially concealed the weight behind it. After that night, he said carefully, I left for Europe the following week. Nia nodded again. Yes. The news reports mentioned the acquisition your company was negotiating. Ethan remembered that trip well. The negotiations had stretched longer than expected, keeping him overseas for several weeks. By the time he returned to New York, the pace of business had accelerated so quickly that most of the personal details from that stormy evening had faded into the background of his schedule. He looked toward the children again. 3 years old. The number echoed once more through his thoughts, now aligned with a timeline he could no longer ignore. Ethan's voice remained controlled when he spoke again, though something beneath it had shifted from curiosity to a quieter gravity. "And when you realized you were expecting children," he said slowly, "you attempted to contact me." Nia met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried since the beginning of the conversation. "Yes," she said. Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for signs of exaggeration or uncertainty. He found none. "How?" he asked. Nia reached into the folder and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper. The edges were worn from time. She placed it gently on the table between them. "I sent a letter," she said quietly, "to the executive office. I addressed it directly to you." Ethan stared at the paper without touching it yet. Outside the window, the city continued moving as it always did, unaware that inside the quiet conference room of Whitmore Holdings, a story that had begun during a storm 3 years earlier was finally unfolding in the clear light of a Manhattan morning. The folded letter rested on the polished conference table between them like a small object that carried far more weight than its thin paper should allow. Ethan Whitmore looked at it for several seconds before reaching forward. His fingers touched the edge carefully, almost cautiously, as if the paper might confirm something he was not yet prepared to fully understand. Across the room, the 3 children continued their quiet conversation with the window, counting the distant helicopters and pointing at the slow movement of traffic below. Their voices were soft and curious, completely unaware that the quiet object on the table had just changed the shape of the morning. Ethan unfolded the letter slowly. The creases showed it had been opened and closed many times over the years. The handwriting was neat and steady, written with the kind of patience that comes from someone choosing every word carefully. He read the first line silently. "Dear Mr. Whitmore." The words continued with simple clarity. She had written about the night of the storm. She had explained that she discovered she was expecting children several weeks after he left for Europe. She had not accused him of anything. She had not demanded money or recognition. Instead, she had written only to inform him of the truth and to say that if he wished to speak with her, she would be willing to meet. The letter ended with a phone number and a small address in Queens. Ethan lowered the paper slowly after finishing the final sentence. The room remained quiet except for the faint voices of the children near the window. He studied the date written in the corner of the page. 3 years ago. Exactly 3 years ago next month. Ethan looked up at Nia again. "I never received this," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only certainty. Nia nodded as if she had already expected that answer. "I realized that after several months passed without a reply." Ethan turned the letter over once more, examining the envelope that had been folded inside it. The executive office address was correct. The attention line included his full name. There was nothing careless or incorrect about it, which meant the letter had reached the building. It simply had not reached him. Ethan placed the paper gently on the table again and leaned back in his chair. For a moment his attention drifted away from the room and back into the memory that had begun resurfacing earlier. The storm that night had been strong enough to shake the glass windows along the upper floors of the building. Rain had struck the city in heavy waves that blurred the streetlights below into long streaks of yellow and white. Most of the gala guests had already left by the time the power fluctuations began. Staff members had guided the remaining attendees out through the emergency-lit corridors, while generators kept the elevators running long enough to clear the building safely. Ethan had remained behind to review the situation with the security team. The building was nearly empty when he had stepped into the break room for coffee. That was where he had seen her again. Nia had been standing near the counter with a clipboard in her hands, reviewing the final transportation list for volunteers who were waiting for the rain to ease. Her hair had been slightly damp from running back and forth between entrances helping guests reach their rides. Yet despite the long evening, she had still moved with the calm focus of someone determined to finish every detail properly before leaving. Ethan remembered how the emergency lights had cast soft reflections across the stainless steel counters while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the building. They had spoken for a while that night, not as a chief executive officer and an event coordinator, but simply as 2 people who had found themselves in the same quiet room while the city outside paused beneath the storm. She had told him about the nonprofit work she supported across the boroughs. He had asked how she managed to keep events running smoothly with limited resources. She had smiled slightly and said organization was simply another form of kindness when many people depended on a small number of resources. The conversation had continued longer than Ethan usually allowed himself during work events. He remembered noticing the calm confidence in her voice, the way she spoke without trying to impress him or avoid his attention. It had felt honest. Rarely did anyone inside Whitmore Holdings speak with that kind of quiet sincerity. Eventually the rain had slowed. Security confirmed the building was clear. Most of the staff left in small groups, but Nia had remained behind a few minutes longer to confirm that the final volunteer transportation had arrived. Ethan had offered to walk her toward the elevators before he returned upstairs. The hallway lights were still dim from the emergency power, giving the building a softer atmosphere than its usual polished brightness. They had paused near the window, overlooking the street where the storm clouds were beginning to break apart. For a moment neither of them had spoken. The city lights reflected faintly across the glass. Ethan remembered that she had laughed quietly when he mentioned how strange the building felt without the usual rush of employees. Buildings are calmer when they remember they are just buildings, she had said. Most of the time people give them too much importance. Ethan had smiled at that. It was a simple observation, but it had stayed with him longer than he expected. The conversation that followed had not been rushed. It had unfolded naturally, two people sharing a quiet moment while the storm passed outside. That memory had always remained gentle in his mind, never dramatic, never complicated. Until now. Ethan returned to the present slowly, his gaze drifting back toward the children near the window. One of them had now discovered the reflection of his own face in the glass, and was pressing his nose gently against the surface while his brother laughed quietly beside him. Ethan felt the strange tightening in his chest again. 3 years. 3 years during which those children had grown, learned to speak, learned to laugh, learned to sit patiently in waiting rooms while their mother searched for work. 3 years during which he had never known they existed. He looked back toward Nia. She had not moved while he read the letter or while his thoughts wandered through the memory of that stormy night. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingers loosely folded as if she had already accepted whatever questions might come next. Ethan spoke again, his voice softer now than it had been earlier. You waited for an answer. Nia nodded slightly. For a while. Ethan studied her expression. And when no answer came, Nia glanced briefly toward the children before returning her gaze to him. I understood that life would continue regardless. Ethan Whitmore looked once more at the folded letter resting on the table between them, and for the first time in years he realized that the most important message someone had ever tried to send him had been sitting somewhere inside his own building all along. The folded letter remained on the table between them long after Ethan Whitmore had finished reading it, the thin paper suddenly heavier than any contract he had signed that morning. Outside the tall windows Manhattan continued moving in its usual rhythm, horns echoing faintly through the glass 40 floors below, sunlight slowly breaking through the fading gray clouds that had hung over the city earlier. Inside the conference room, however, time seemed to pause around a quieter gravity that neither Ethan nor Nia Brooks attempted to interrupt. The children near the window had discovered the reflection of their own faces in the glass, and were now laughing softly as they pressed their small hands against the cool surface, leaving faint fingerprints that caught the morning light. Ethan watched them for a moment without speaking. The smallest boy tilted his head again in that familiar, thoughtful way that had unsettled Ethan since the moment he first noticed him in the lobby. There was no doubt left in Ethan's mind now. The resemblance was no longer a possibility. It was a truth sitting a few yards away counting helicopters in the sky. Ethan exhaled slowly and returned his gaze to Nia. You said you waited for an answer, he said quietly. Nia nodded once. Yes. Ethan looked again at the date on the letter. How long, he asked. Nia considered the question for a moment, as if measuring time not in months, but in moments that had shaped the years since. Several months, she said calmly. At first I assumed the letter had simply not reached you yet. I understood that someone in your position would have a large staff handling correspondence. Ethan's eyes moved briefly toward the letter again. That explanation made sense. The executive office received hundreds of letters each week. Most were filtered by assistants before ever reaching his desk. Still, something about the idea that this particular letter had been quietly redirected or dismissed without his knowledge created a tightness in his chest that he could not easily ignore. Nia continued, speaking in the same steady tone she had used from the beginning of the conversation. After the first month passed, I called the office number listed on the website. The receptionist told me the executive office does not handle personal messages. She suggested sending another letter. Ethan listened carefully. The quiet honesty in her voice made the story feel less like a complaint and more like a simple account of events that had already settled into the past. "Did you send another one?" he asked. Nia shook her head slightly. "No. By that time I had already learned something else." Ethan raised his eyes. "What was that?" Nia glanced again toward the children by the window. The three of them had now begun counting the floors of the neighboring skyscraper across the avenue, pointing upward while whispering numbers to each other. The calmness of their small world stood in quiet contrast to the conversation unfolding across the table. Nia looked back at Ethan. "I learned I was expecting more than one child." Ethan felt the words settle slowly in the air. Even though he had already seen the evidence in the room around him, hearing the moment described brought a different weight to the story. "Triplets," he said softly. Nia nodded. "Yes." Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing the information with the same thoughtful attention he usually reserved for complicated negotiations. But this situation had nothing to do with negotiation. It had everything to do with choices made quietly when no one else was watching. "What did the doctor say?" Ethan asked. Nia allowed herself a small breath before answering. "The doctor said it would be challenging, but not impossible. The pregnancy required careful monitoring and regular appointments. I was working 2 jobs at the time, so I adjusted my schedule." Ethan's brow tightened slightly. "2 jobs." Nia gave a small nod. "Event coordination does not always provide stable income. I worked evenings assisting with nonprofit fundraising events and mornings helping a community office organize volunteer records." Ethan looked toward the children again, imagining the months she was describing. Long subway rides between boroughs, early mornings and late nights balanced carefully around medical appointments, all while preparing for 3 children instead of 1. He returned his gaze to Nia. "You never attempted to contact me again?" he asked. Nia's answer came without hesitation. "No." Ethan studied her face, searching for the emotion that most people might have carried in a similar situation. Anger, bitterness, regret. Yet none of those appeared in her expression. Instead, there was a calm strength that felt steady, almost protective. "Why not?" Ethan asked quietly. Nia rested her hands lightly on the table, fingers folded together. "Because the letter had already given you the information you needed," she said. Ethan remained silent for a moment. "But you said you believed it might not have reached me." Nia nodded again. "That is possible. Then why stop trying?" Ethan asked. Nia's eyes moved briefly toward the children once more before returning to him. "Because a child should never feel like a negotiation," she said gently. Ethan felt that sentence settle deeper than the others. Nia continued. "If you had received the letter and chosen not to respond, that would have been your decision. If the letter never reached you, then I believe that perhaps life had simply taken us in different directions. Either way, I decided the children deserved a life built on certainty, not waiting." Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table as he absorbed her words. The calm logic of her explanation carried a quiet dignity he had not expected. "So you raised them alone?" he said softly. Nia gave a small shrug that did not diminish the strength behind the statement. "Many parents do." Ethan glanced again toward the window where the 3 children now stood shoulder to shoulder, watching a helicopter cross the sky above the Hudson River. Their laughter drifted across the room in soft bursts. It was the sound of a childhood that had continued without him for 3 full years. Ethan leaned forward slightly again. "Why come here today?" he asked. Nia's answer came simply. "Because I need stable work." Ethan watched her carefully. "And that is the only reason?" Nia met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Ethan studied her expression one more time, measuring the quiet certainty behind her words. Then he turned his attention toward the children again. One of them noticed him looking and waved with a shy smile before returning to the window. Ethan Whitmore, a man accustomed to controlling outcomes with careful precision, realized that the most significant decision of his life was no longer something that could be solved with strategy or negotiation. It was standing quietly across the room, counting helicopters in the sky. The quiet inside the conference room deepened after Ethan Whitmore spoke about the children standing near the window, and for several seconds neither he nor Nia Brooks moved. The morning sun had finally pushed through the thin clouds outside, sending pale lines of light across the polished floor and the long conference table where the folded letters still rested. From the 42nd floor the city looked almost peaceful, but inside the room a different kind of realization was slowly unfolding. Ethan watched the three small figures by the glass as if trying to understand how three entire lives could have existed so close to him without his knowledge. The smallest boy was now crouched near the window, studying the slow movement of boats along the Hudson River far below. His sister leaned beside him, her hands resting on the glass as she followed his finger pointing toward the water. The third child had climbed carefully onto the edge of a chair to see the skyline better. Their voices were soft, curious, the way children speak when they are discovering something new together. Ethan listened to them for a moment before speaking again. His voice remained steady, but the calm carried more depth than before. What are their names? Nia turned slightly in her chair to look toward the children. A faint warmth crossed her face when she spoke. The boy near the chair is Noah. The girl beside him is Naomi. And the one pointing at the river is Nathan. Ethan repeated the names quietly in his mind, as if committing them to memory. Noah, Naomi, Nathan. Three names that suddenly felt far more important than the dozen business meetings waiting on his schedule upstairs. He studied the children again, noticing the small differences between them now that he was looking more carefully. Noah carried the thoughtful expression Ethan had seen in the lobby, the kind of quiet focus that suggested a mind constantly observing the world. Naomi's eyes moved quickly from one detail to another, absorbing everything with an alert curiosity. Nathan appeared the calmest of the three, watching his brother and sister with the steady patience of someone who preferred listening before speaking. Ethan turned back toward Nia slowly. You said you were working 2 jobs when you learned about the pregnancy, he said. Nia nodded. Yes. Ethan folded his hands again on the table, the same posture he often used when listening to a complex explanation. What happened after that? Nia leaned back slightly in her chair, as if the question had opened a door into memories she had not spoken aloud in some time. She did not rush the answer. Instead, she chose her words carefully, the same way she had chosen every step of the story so far. The doctor explained that carrying triplets meant I would need frequent appointments, she began quietly. At first I tried to continue both jobs, but eventually the schedule became too demanding. Ethan listened without interrupting. Outside the window, a helicopter crossed the skyline again, its distant shadow sliding briefly across the conference room walls. Nia continued. The nonprofit office where I worked in the mornings allowed me to reduce my hours. They helped arrange a flexible schedule so I could attend medical visits. Ethan's brow tightened slightly with concentration. And the evening job? Nia gave a small, almost amused exhale. Event coordination is not very flexible during the final weeks before a fundraiser. Eventually, I had to step away. Ethan nodded slowly. He could imagine the financial strain that must have followed. New York City was not forgiving when income suddenly changed. How did you manage the rest of the pregnancy? He asked. Nia rested one hand lightly against the folder on the table, as if the motion grounded the memory she was describing. Carefully, she said with a faint smile. The doctor recommended limiting travel after the 2nd trimester, which meant I stayed mostly in Queens. The community office allowed me to help remotely with organizing volunteer records. Ethan absorbed the explanation quietly. The image forming in his mind was very different from the polished offices surrounding them. Instead of conference rooms and assistants, he pictured a small apartment where paperwork and medical instructions might have been spread across a kitchen table while subway trains passed somewhere outside the window. Were there complications? Ethan asked gently. Nia paused before answering, not because the question upset her, but because she wanted the response to remain simple and accurate. There were challenges, she said calmly. Multiple pregnancies require careful monitoring, but the doctors were excellent. Ethan watched her face as she spoke. There was no trace of self-pity in her expression, only the quiet confidence of someone who had already walked through the hardest part of the story. Across the room, Noah had discovered the reflection of his sister's face in the glass again, and was laughing softly as Naomi tried to make funny shapes with her hands. Nathan leaned against the chair beside them, watching both of them with a small smile that seemed older than his 3 years. Ethan felt the now familiar tightening in his chest again as he realized how many small moments like that had taken place without him there to see them. And when they were born, he asked quietly. Nia's eyes softened slightly at the memory. Early in the morning, she said. The hospital room looked out toward the East River. The sun was just coming up. Ethan remained still, listening carefully. Triplets often arrive earlier than expected, she continued. But the medical team was prepared. Ethan noticed the subtle change in her voice when she spoke about that morning. It was not dramatic. It was simply the quiet strength of someone remembering the moment their life had permanently changed. Were you alone? Ethan asked after a moment. Nia nodded once. Yes. The answer settled into the room gently, without bitterness. Ethan's gaze drifted again toward the three children who were now sitting together on the floor near the window, whispering to each other while they examined a small reflection of sunlight on the carpet. Ethan Whitmore, a man who had spent most of his adult life surrounded by teams of advisors and assistants, suddenly felt the enormous weight of that single word. Alone. Nia continued softly. The nurses were very kind. They helped me learn how to care for 3 newborns at once. Ethan allowed the silence to linger again as he imagined those early days. 3 small cribs. Feeding schedules that never aligned. Nights broken into fragments of sleep and morning routines that began long before sunrise. All of it carried by one person who had never asked him for anything beyond the letter he never received. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. And for 3 years you have been raising them on your own. Nia nodded, though the gesture carried the same calm strength as every answer she had given so far. Yes. Ethan leaned back slowly, looking once more at the 3 small lives that had grown quietly in the space where his own absence had once existed. For the first time since the morning began, the meeting upstairs no longer felt urgent. The phone calls waiting in his office no longer felt important. Because across the room 3 children were laughing softly beside a window overlooking the city, and Ethan Whitmore had just begun to understand that everything he thought defined his life might not be the most important thing he had built. For a long moment Ethan Whitmore did not speak again. The quiet inside the conference room seemed to stretch wider than the skyline beyond the glass, and the soft voices of the children near the window became the only sound moving through the space. Noah was now crouched on the carpet with Nathan beside him, both of them studying the thin beam of sunlight that had slipped through the tall window and landed across the floor like a narrow golden path. Naomi stood over them with her hands on her hips, offering quiet instructions as if she were organizing an important experiment. Ethan watched them with the steady attention of someone who had suddenly realized that the most important part of a story had been unfolding beyond his sight for years. Finally, he shifted slightly in his chair and looked back at Nia Brooks. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried a depth that had not been present earlier in the conversation. Miss Brooks, he said slowly, you came here today to ask for work. Nia nodded once. Yes. Ethan folded his hands together again on the table, though the gesture was no longer the formal posture he used during negotiations. It felt more like someone gathering his thoughts carefully before speaking about something that mattered. You said administrative work would be acceptable, he continued. Scheduling, record organization, office support. That is correct, Nia replied. Ethan glanced toward the children again before returning his attention to her. And if I had not walked through the lobby this morning? Nia gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Then I would have left my resume with the reception desk and continued applying elsewhere. Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for any sign that the answer carried hidden expectation. He found none. She was simply describing the plan she had already accepted before entering the building. The realization made something in Ethan's chest tighten again, though he could not immediately explain why. You did not come here hoping I would recognize you, he said. Nia shook her head. No. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing that answer. For years he had been surrounded by people who approached him with clear intentions. Investors seeking partnership, executives seeking approval, journalists seeking statements. Even charity organizers often arrived with carefully structured requests. Yet the woman sitting across from him had entered the building that morning expecting nothing more than a chance to submit a resume. The simplicity of that truth felt unexpectedly powerful. Ethan looked toward the children again. Naomi had now convinced Noah to stand on a chair so he could see farther down the river, while Nathan watched carefully to make sure his brother did not lose balance. Their quiet teamwork seemed natural, practiced through countless small moments of learning how to exist together. Ethan turned back toward Nia slowly. "You said you needed stable work," he said. "Yes." "Is the community office no longer enough?" Ethan asked. Nia answered honestly. "The office is supported by volunteers and donations. Some months there is more work than others. I am grateful for the opportunity they gave me, but raising 3 children requires consistency." Ethan nodded slowly. That explanation required no further clarification. Anyone who understood even the basic cost of living in New York City knew how quickly expenses could accumulate. Rent alone could consume most of a modest income, and childcare for 3 young children would add another layer of difficulty. Ethan rested his fingertips lightly against the edge of the table as he thought for a moment. The logical part of his mind began assembling possibilities in the same methodical way he analyzed business decisions. Whitmore Holdings employed thousands of people across several departments. Administrative support positions existed in nearly every division of the company. Yet the situation sitting across the table from him was not simply about filling an open role. It was about a truth that had quietly altered the foundation of his life during the past hour. Ethan spoke again carefully. "There are positions available in the operations department that match the skills you described." Nia listened without interrupting. "However," Ethan continued, "those roles require a formal hiring process." Nia nodded calmly. "I understand." Ethan studied her expression again. There was no frustration in her voice, no sign that she expected special treatment. She simply accepted the explanation the way someone accepts the rules of a system they have learned to navigate carefully. Ethan felt a faint sense of admiration at the quiet steadiness she carried. Many people in her position might have tried to leverage the situation unfolding in the room. She had not done that once. Instead, she remained focused on the same practical request she had brought with her from the beginning. Work, stability, opportunity earned through effort rather than assumption. Ethan exhaled slowly and shifted his attention toward the children once more. Naomi had now moved closer to the window and was tracing shapes in the thin layer of dust along the lower frame while explaining something about airplanes to her brothers. Noah listened with serious attention, while Nathan occasionally nodded, as if confirming her observations. The 3 of them formed a small circle of curiosity that seemed completely unaffected by the quiet tension unfolding across the room. Ethan watched them carefully. For years he had measured success through expansion, acquisitions, and quarterly growth. Yet in that moment, the simple image of 3 children discovering the skyline felt far more real than any number displayed in a financial report. Ethan turned back toward Nia again. His voice remained composed, but the decision forming behind it had begun to solidify. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I would like to understand more about the work you have done." Nia tilted her head slightly, listening. "Your experience organizing nonprofit events suggests strong logistical skills," Ethan continued. "That kind of coordination is valuable inside a company this size." Nia nodded slowly. "I enjoy organizing systems that help people work more efficiently." Ethan allowed a small smile to appear, the first sign of lightness that had entered the conversation all morning. "That is a useful ability," he said. Nia returned the smile faintly, but remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. Ethan paused for a moment, considering the next sentence carefully. Across the room, Noah suddenly pointed excitedly toward the river where a bright white ferry had just appeared between the buildings. Naomi and Nathan rushed to the window beside him, their laughter echoing softly through the conference room. Ethan watched them again, feeling the weight of everything he had learned since the morning began. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the steady resolve of someone who understood that the next decision would shape far more than a simple hiring process. "There may be a way for you to begin working here sooner than the formal process would normally allow," he said quietly. Nia's eyes lifted slightly, not with surprise, but with careful curiosity. Ethan continued, his gaze steady. "But before we discuss that, there is something else we need to address. Because the situation in this room is not only about employment anymore." The children's laughter continued near the window as sunlight spread slowly across the carpet. And for the first time since the morning began, Ethan Whitmore felt certain that the direction of his life had already begun to change. The laughter near the window slowly softened as the ferry disappeared between the buildings along the river, leaving the children once again studying the slow rhythm of the city far below. Sunlight continued spreading across the carpet, warming the quiet conference room, where Ethan Whitmore sat facing Nia Brooks with a realization that no boardroom discussion had ever prepared him for. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt like the moment before a truth finally settles into the open air. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table while the folded letter remained beside his wrist. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but deliberate. "Miss Brooks, the situation we are discussing is no longer limited to a hiring decision." Nia held his gaze steadily. "I understand that." Ethan nodded once. He appreciated the clarity in her voice. There was no attempt to avoid the subject that had been building in the room since the moment he first saw the children in the lobby. Across the room, Noah was pointing again toward the skyline, explaining something to Nathan while Naomi listened with the patient seriousness of someone deciding whether her brother's theory made sense. Ethan watched them for a moment before returning his attention to Nia. "3 children," he said quietly. 3 years. Nia did not respond immediately, but her expression confirmed the truth behind those simple numbers. Ethan continued slowly. "If the letter had reached my desk, this conversation would have happened a long time ago." Nia nodded once. "Perhaps." Ethan noticed she did not say it with accusation. She simply acknowledged the possibility. The calm dignity in that response settled deeper in Ethan's mind than any argument would have. He leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing again toward the window where the children now stood shoulder to shoulder, watching a small airplane cross the bright blue space above the Hudson River. Their voices were soft, filled with the quiet curiosity of children discovering the world piece by piece. Ethan Whitmore had spent most of his life making decisions quickly, but this moment demanded something different. It required understanding not only the past, but also the path forward. He turned back toward Nia again. "There are questions we should address carefully," he said. Nia nodded. "I expected that." Ethan's eyes remained steady. "The first question is simple. Have the children ever asked about their father?" Nia allowed a small breath before answering. "Not yet, in a way that requires explanation." Ethan listened closely. "They know families come in different forms," she continued. "They know they have a mother who cares for them and a community around them. For now, that has been enough." Ethan absorbed the answer quietly. Across the room, Naomi had now begun explaining the difference between helicopters and airplanes to her brothers, using small hand gestures that made both boys laugh softly. The sound of that laughter filled the space between Ethan and Nia in a way that felt both gentle and heavy at the same time. Ethan spoke again. "And when they eventually ask?" Nia's voice remained calm. "Then I will tell them the truth." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly in thought. "Which truth?" Nia did not hesitate. "That their father is someone I once cared about. That circumstances separated our paths before their lives began. And that people sometimes need time to understand what family truly means." Ethan studied her carefully. The answer carried no bitterness. It carried something far more powerful. Respect. Respect for the truth, and respect for the children who would one day ask the question she had prepared herself to answer. Ethan leaned forward again, his voice quieter now. "You never planned to come here and reveal this." Nia shook her head gently. "No, even today," Ethan continued. "You intended to apply for work and leave without mentioning any of it." "Yes." Ethan looked toward the children once more. Noah had climbed onto the chair again to see the skyline better, and Nathan stood beside him, making sure he did not lose balance, while Naomi continued narrating everything she noticed outside the window. The 3 of them moved with the quiet teamwork of siblings who had learned to rely on one another. Ethan felt the same tightening in his chest again. 3 years of mornings, birthdays, doctor visits, bedtime stories, and small discoveries like the ferry crossing the river. All of it had existed without him. He turned back toward Nia. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, "I want to make something clear." Nia listened. Ethan continued carefully. "What I am saying now is not about obligation. It is not about legal responsibility or reputation. It is about reality." Nia did not interrupt. Ethan's voice remained steady. "Those children deserve to know their father." Nia's eyes softened slightly, but her posture remained composed. "Perhaps they do." Ethan studied her response. That is not the same as saying you want me involved. Nia folded her hands lightly on the table. Wanting something and forcing something are different things. Ethan allowed a faint breath to escape, almost a quiet laugh at the honesty in her answer. You are careful with your words, he said. Nia offered a small smile. 3 children teach you patience. Across the room, Naomi suddenly turned toward them and waved excitedly. Mom, there is a big ship, she called softly. Nia glanced toward the window and smiled. I see it, she replied gently. The children returned to their observations, leaving the adults once again in the quiet gravity of their conversation. Ethan watched them for another moment before speaking again. Miss Brooks, I do not expect an answer today about what role I may have in their lives. Nia nodded slowly. Ethan continued, but I would like the opportunity to earn that place rather than assume it. Nia studied his face for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity behind the words. The room remained silent except for the distant hum of the city beyond the glass. Finally she spoke. Earning something requires time. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Nia continued softly. And trust. Ethan's voice did not waver. I understand that as well. The sunlight had now spread across the entire floor of the conference room, touching the chairs where the children stood near the window. Their small silhouettes stretched across the carpet as they continued describing the skyline to one another. Ethan Whitmore looked at them again and realized that the most important work of his life might not be waiting upstairs in a boardroom after all. It might begin quietly right here in this room, with patience, honesty, and a simple willingness to show up. The quiet promise of patience lingered in the conference room long after Ethan Whitmore spoke about earning his place rather than claiming it. Sunlight continued drifting across the floor, and the faint reflection of the Hudson River shimmered through the glass as the morning grew brighter over Manhattan. Near the window, the children had discovered that their voices echoed softly when they spoke close to the glass, and the small discovery had turned into a quiet game of whispering and listening for the faint bounce of their own words. Noah spoke first, then Nathan repeated what he heard, and Naomi giggled each time the echo returned slightly different than expected. Their laughter filled the room with a gentle warmth that contrasted with the steady gravity of the conversation still unfolding across the conference table. Ethan watched them for a moment before turning back toward Nia Brooks. His posture had relaxed slightly, but the seriousness in his eyes had not faded. You mentioned trust, he said slowly. Nia nodded once. Yes. Ethan rested his hands together again, the same thoughtful posture he often used when examining complicated decisions, but this time his voice carried a quieter tone. Trust does not appear overnight, he said. I know that. Nia studied him carefully, as if measuring whether those words were simply polite understanding or the beginning of something deeper. Ethan continued, but it also does not grow unless someone takes the first step. Nia allowed a faint breath to leave her chest before responding. That is true. Ethan glanced again toward the children. Naomi had now convinced Noah and Nathan to sit cross-legged on the carpet while she explained how ships must move slower than airplanes because water and air behave differently. The boys listened with serious concentration, nodding occasionally as if her explanation carried the authority of a scientist presenting a theory. Ethan allowed a small smile to appear at the corner of his mouth before returning his attention to Nia. You have built a life for them that appears steady, he said. Nia responded simply. I have tried. Ethan nodded once. And you have done that without asking anything from me. Nia did not deny it. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, considering the situation from a different angle now. But even if you never expected anything from me, he continued, there are still questions about what comes next. Nia folded her hands lightly on the table again. That is why I said trust takes time. Ethan studied her expression for a moment. Do the children attend daycare? He asked. Nia nodded. Yes. A small center 2 blocks from our apartment. Ethan absorbed that detail quietly. And the community office where you work now, he said. Is it nearby? 10 minutes by subway, Nia answered. Ethan glanced toward the window. Again, watching as Noah suddenly stood up and pressed both hands against the glass while pointing excitedly toward a helicopter crossing the sky. Naomi immediately stood beside him, explaining something about how the spinning blades kept the aircraft balanced in the air. Nathan listened carefully before attempting to mimic the motion with his own hands. The scene carried a simple joy that made the conference room feel less like an executive office and more like a quiet corner of a family's day. Ethan spoke again. Miss Brooks, I want to ask something important. Nia nodded calmly. Go ahead. Ethan's voice remained steady. Would you be comfortable if I spent time getting to know them slowly? Nia did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the children near the window for several seconds before turning back toward Ethan. Children notice sincerity faster than adults do, she said quietly. Ethan listened carefully. If you spend time with them simply because you feel obligated, she continued, they will sense that. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Nia's gaze remained steady. But if you are truly willing to show up consistently, without rushing their trust or expecting them to understand everything immediately, then I believe they deserve the chance to know you. Ethan absorbed her words slowly. Across the room, Naomi had begun teaching her brothers how to wave at the helicopter as if the pilot might see them through the clouds. Their small hands moved enthusiastically in the sunlight. Ethan felt the now familiar tightening in his chest again. 3 small lives that had begun quietly while he was across an ocean negotiating acquisitions and financial strategies. 3 children who had learned how to laugh, learn, and grow without him ever realizing they existed. He looked back toward Nia again. Consistency, he repeated quietly. Nia nodded. Yes. Ethan's voice carried quiet determination when he spoke again. That is something I can offer. Nia studied him carefully, not with suspicion but with the cautious patience of someone who had learned that promises alone were not enough. Then we begin slowly, she said. Ethan nodded once. Slowly. For a moment neither of them spoke again. The children had now moved from the window to the chairs near the wall, turning the seats into imaginary control panels while Naomi pretended to guide an airplane across the skyline. Noah and Nathan followed her instructions with serious concentration, occasionally adjusting. Invisible switches that existed only in their shared game. Ethan watched them with quiet fascination. The scene felt strangely peaceful despite the weight of everything that had been revealed during the past hour. Finally, Ethan looked back at Nia. There is something else we should address, he said. Nia tilted her head slightly. What is that? Ethan glanced briefly at the folded letter still resting on the table. The letter you sent 3 years ago did reach this building, he said carefully. Nia nodded once. Yes. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly with thought. Which means someone inside my office received it before it ever reached my desk. Nia did not appear surprised by that conclusion. That is possible. Ethan's voice remained calm, but there was a quiet firmness beneath the words now. I will find out what happened to it. Nia watched him thoughtfully. Why? Ethan met her gaze. Because if someone prevented that message from reaching me, they did not just interrupt a piece of correspondence. He paused briefly before finishing the sentence. They interrupted 3 years of my children's lives. Nia studied his expression carefully as the weight of that realization settled between them. Near the window, Naomi's imaginary airplane had now landed safely on the carpet runway, while Noah and Nathan celebrated the successful flight with quiet applause. Ethan Whitmore looked at them once more and realized that the next chapter of his life would not begin with contracts or board meetings. It would begin with patience, responsibility, and the quiet determination to show up where he should have been all along. The quiet weight of Ethan Whitmore's final words lingered in the conference room long after he spoke about the missing letter and the 3 years that had passed without his knowledge. The sunlight had climbed higher now, bright enough to wash the tops of the buildings across the Hudson in pale gold. Inside the room, the children had turned their imaginary airplane game into something new. Naomi stood in the center of the carpet explaining that their next mission required them to count every helicopter they could see in the sky. Noah had moved back toward the glass window again, scanning the horizon carefully as if he had been assigned the role of lookout. Nathan sat cross-legged beside the chair, holding an invisible radio in his hands while whispering updates about the flight path. There. Small voices filled the space with quiet energy that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Ethan watched them for a long moment before speaking again. 3 years, he said softly, almost to himself. Nia Brooks did not interrupt. She had learned during the past hour that Ethan sometimes spoke more honestly when he allowed the silence to shape his thoughts first. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the children near the window. 3 years of birthdays, he continued quietly. 3 years of first words, first steps, First days at daycare. Nia's expression softened slightly, though she remained composed. Yes. Ethan rested his hands together again on the edge of the table. I cannot change the time that has already passed, he said carefully. But I can decide what happens next. Nia studied him calmly. She had expected this moment to arrive eventually, though she had not imagined it unfolding inside a glass conference room overlooking Manhattan. Ethan turned toward her again, his voice steady but thoughtful. You said the daycare is 2 blocks from your apartment. Yes, Nia answered. And the community office where you work is 10 minutes away by subway. That is correct. Ethan nodded slowly. If you accept the position here, how would that affect your schedule? Nia considered the question for a moment. Daycare opens at 8 in the morning, she said. I usually drop them off before starting work. Ethan glanced toward the children again. Naomi had now convinced Nathan to stand on the chair, so he could see whether another helicopter might appear above the river. Noah stood beside them, pointing excitedly at a distant cargo ship moving slowly along the water. Ethan allowed himself a small smile before returning his attention to Nia. Whitmore Holdings begins its regular workday at 9, he said. That would give you time to manage your morning routine. Nia nodded slowly, understanding the implication behind the statement. Ethan continued. There is also a child care center 2 floors below this office. Nia raised her eyebrows slightly. For employees? Yes, Ethan replied. The company created it several years ago for staff members who needed flexible support. Nia absorbed that information carefully. I did not know that. Ethan gave a small nod. Most people outside the company do not. Across the room, the children had now discovered that their reflections in the glass could form funny shapes when they pressed their noses against the window. Naomi demonstrated first, causing Noah and Nathan to burst into quiet laughter. Ethan watched them with the same thoughtful attention he had carried since the morning began. The sound of their laughter made the decision forming in his mind feel even clearer. He turned back toward Nia again. Miss Brooks, he said calmly. If you choose to work here, the child care center would allow them to stay nearby during the day. Nia looked toward the children for a moment before returning her gaze to Ethan. That would certainly make life easier, she admitted. Ethan nodded once. It would also allow me to see them occasionally. The honesty in that statement hung gently in the air between them. Nia did not immediately respond. Instead, she studied his expression carefully, searching for the sincerity behind the words. She had spent 3 years making decisions that protected her children from uncertainty. This moment required the same careful judgment. Ethan spoke again after a short pause. I am not asking for anything to change overnight, he said. But if they are nearby during the day, I could begin with small moments. A short visit during lunch. Perhaps helping them explore the building's observation deck. Nia listened quietly. Simple interactions, Ethan continued. Nothing that disrupts their routine. Nia allowed a faint breath to leave her chest. Children notice consistency more than grand gestures, she said softly. Ethan nodded immediately. That is exactly what I intend. Across the room, Naomi suddenly turned toward them. Mom, there is another helicopter, she called with excitement. Nia smiled warmly. I see it, she replied gently. Noah waved at the aircraft again, while Nathan tried to count how many times its blades spun each second. Their curiosity filled the room with the bright energy of childhood discovery. Ethan watched them once more, and something inside him settled with quiet certainty. When he spoke again, his voice carried calm determination. Miss Brooks, I would like to offer you a position within the operations department starting next week. Nia blinked once, not out of shock, but out of careful consideration. Ethan continued before she could respond. The role will involve organizing scheduling systems and coordinating internal support teams. The salary will reflect the standard compensation for that position. Nia listened attentively. Ethan's voice remained steady. Your employment will follow the same professional expectations as any other employee. There will be no special arrangements beyond the childcare support already available to staff. Nia nodded slowly. I appreciate that. Ethan allowed a small smile. I thought you might. Nia looked toward the children again, watching as Noah tried to imitate the sound of the helicopter while Naomi corrected his attempt with patient instruction. Nathan listened carefully before adding his own version of the sound. Their laughter echoed softly through the room. Nia turned back toward Ethan after a moment. I will accept the position, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. the decision settling into place with quiet clarity. Outside the window, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that inside one small conference room a future was being quietly rebuilt from a truth that had waited 3 years to be heard. Ethan Whitmore looked toward the 3 children standing in the sunlight and understood that the most important investment he would ever make had nothing to do with numbers or markets. It had everything to do with showing up where life had quietly been waiting for him all along. The agreement settled into the quiet air of the conference room like the final piece of a long, unfinished sentence. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan continued its endless motion, sunlight reflecting off glass towers while traffic moved along the avenues far below. Inside the room, the 3 children remained absorbed in their small discoveries near the window, unaware that the direction of their lives had just begun to shift in a way none of them could yet understand. Ethan Whitmore watched them carefully, the faint smile from a moment earlier still resting on his face as he considered what the next step should be. For years his days had been built around decisions that affected markets and companies, but this moment required something far simpler and far more meaningful. It required a first introduction. He stood slowly from his chair, the quiet movement drawing Nia Brooks's attention immediately. She followed his gaze toward the children and understood what he was about to do even before he spoke. Ethan walked across the carpet toward the window with deliberate calm, careful not to interrupt the rhythm of their game too abruptly. Naomi noticed him first. She paused in the middle of explaining another theory about airplanes and turned to look up at him with curious eyes. Noah followed her gaze a moment later, while Nathan remained focused on the skyline for another second before realizing the adults were approaching. Ethan stopped a few feet away so he would not tower over them too suddenly. For a brief moment, he simply observed them, letting the quiet details settle in his mind. The soft curls of Naomi's hair catching the sunlight. The thoughtful crease that appeared between Noah's eyebrows when he concentrated. The calm steadiness in Nathan's posture as he studied the city. 3 children who had already begun shaping the world around them in their own small ways. Ethan crouched slightly, so his height would be closer to theirs. His voice, when he spoke, carried the gentle patience of someone choosing his words with care. "You have a very good view from this window," he said. Naomi nodded immediately. "You can see everything," she replied proudly. Noah pointed toward the river again. "There are boats and helicopters and airplanes," he added with enthusiasm. Nathan studied Ethan's face quietly, his eyes measuring the stranger who had suddenly joined their observation post. Ethan smiled faintly. "It seems like you are keeping track of the whole city." Naomi straightened her shoulders slightly, as if accepting an important responsibility. "We are making sure the airplanes do not crash into the buildings," she explained. Ethan allowed a soft laugh to escape. "That is a very important job." Noah leaned closer to the glass again. "We saw 3 helicopters already," he said seriously. Nathan lifted 3 fingers to confirm the count. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Then you must be very good observers." The children exchanged pleased glances. Their game had just received official recognition from a grown-up who appeared to take their mission seriously. Ethan shifted his attention gently from one child to the next. "Your mother told me your names," he said. "Noah, Naomi, and Nathan." Naomi nodded proudly again. Noah gave a small wave. Nathan remained quiet, but continued studying Ethan with careful attention. Ethan placed one hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair, keeping his posture relaxed so the moment would feel natural rather than formal. "My name is Ethan," he said calmly. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You work here?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes." Noah glanced around the large conference room as if suddenly realizing they were standing inside a place that belonged to the tall man kneeling beside them. "Do you fly the helicopters?" he asked hopefully. Ethan smiled again. "No, but sometimes I get to watch them from this window, just like you." Nathan finally spoke, his voice quieter than his brother and sister, but steady. "Do you have games in this building?" Ethan considered the question for a moment. "There might be a few places where people can explore," he said. "There is a big observation deck upstairs that shows the whole city." Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "Bigger than this window?" "Much bigger," Ethan replied. Noah looked impressed. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, as if adding the information to a mental map of possibilities. Across the room, Nia watched the scene quietly, her arms folded gently as she studied the careful way Ethan spoke with the children. There was no rush in his voice, no attempt to impress them with grand promises. He simply followed the rhythm of their curiosity. Ethan turned back toward the window again. "If you ever come back to visit this building," he said to them, "I could show you that observation deck." Naomi glanced toward her mother for approval before looking back at Ethan. "Maybe we can count more helicopters there," she said. Ethan nodded. "That sounds like a good plan." Noah raised his hand suddenly. "Can we also see the ships?" "Yes," Ethan replied. "You can see the river very clearly from up there." Nathan finally allowed a small smile to appear. For a few seconds the four of them simply stood near the window watching the skyline together. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, a reminder of how many stories were unfolding at the same time within its streets and towers. Ethan eventually stood again, careful not to break the calm atmosphere that had formed around the children. He turned slightly toward Nia, who had remained near the conference table observing quietly. Their eyes met briefly, and the understanding between them required no words. The first step had been taken, slowly and respectfully, just as they had agreed. Naomi returned her attention to the glass window again, pointing out another small aircraft moving across the sky. Noah followed her gesture, while Nathan counted carefully under his breath. Ethan Whitmore stood beside them for a moment longer, realizing that the most meaningful introduction of his life had just happened not in a boardroom or on a stage, but beside a simple window where three curious children were learning to watch the world. For several minutes, the quiet observation at the window continued, the children speaking softly as they counted another helicopter and argued gently about whether the ferry on the river was faster than the cargo ship that followed behind it. The sunlight had now filled the entire conference room, warming the floor and softening the sharp reflections of glass and steel that usually defined the offices of Whitmore Holdings. Ethan Whitmore remained standing near them, his attention moving between the skyline outside and the three small voices beside him. He had attended hundreds of meetings in side rooms like this one, but none of those moments had ever felt as real as the simple scene unfolding beside the window. Finally, Naomi turned toward him again, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Do you come here every day?" she asked. Ethan nodded gently. "Most days, yes." Noah looked surprised. "That must be a lot of helicopters to count." Ethan smiled faintly. "I think I have missed many of them before today." Nathan tilted his head thoughtfully, as if considering that statement. "Then you should watch more," he said quietly. Ethan allowed a small laugh to escape. "That is good advice." Across the room, Nia Brooks remained near the table, watching the exchange with calm attention. She had expected the children to approach the situation with curiosity rather than fear, but seeing the moment unfold still carried a quiet weight she had not fully prepared for. For 3 years the world of those children had been carefully balanced around routines she had built alone. Now that balance was beginning to expand in ways she had once imagined but never planned to force. Ethan eventually stepped back from the window and motioned toward the chairs again. "You must be getting hungry after such important observation work," he said lightly. Naomi immediately looked toward her mother. "Mom, can we eat soon?" she asked. Nia nodded with a small smile. "Yes, we will leave soon." Noah climbed down from the chair, while Nathan carefully adjusted his jacket, as if preparing for a serious mission. Ethan returned to the conference table with them following behind, their footsteps soft against the carpet. The shift from the window back to the center of the room carried a subtle sense that the morning was moving toward its next stage. Ethan sat down again across from Nia, though the formal distance between them no longer felt as rigid as it had earlier. Naomi climbed onto the chair beside her mother, while Noah and Nathan sat side by side, their legs swinging slightly beneath the table. Ethan looked at them for a moment before speaking again. "You did very good work watching the sky," he said. Noah straightened proudly. "We counted 5 helicopters," he reported. Nathan corrected him gently. 6 if you include the one that went behind the building. Naomi nodded in agreement. "Yes, 6. Ethan raised his hand slightly, as if accepting the official record. "Then 6 it is." The children exchanged satisfied glances before returning to quiet whispers about whether the ships on the river might also need observers. Ethan turned back toward Nia again. "The human resources team will prepare the paperwork for your position," he said calmly. "You can begin orientation early next week." Nia nodded. "Thank you." Ethan continued. "The child care center will also be ready to receive them whenever you start. Nia glanced briefly at the children before looking back at him. I appreciate that. Ethan folded his hands together again. This arrangement will allow everything to move forward in a structured way. Nia understood what he meant. Structure was something both of them valued, even if their lives had been shaped by very different circumstances. For a moment the conversation paused again, while Naomi carefully aligned 3 imaginary buttons on the table and explained to her brothers how the airplane control system should work. Ethan watched them with a quiet expression before speaking once more. I will also begin looking into the matter of the letter, he said. Nia did not appear surprised by that statement. You believe someone intercepted it? Ethan nodded slowly. It is the only explanation that makes sense. Nia considered the idea for a moment. What will you do if you find out who handled it? Ethan's voice remained steady. First I will understand what happened. Then I will decide what action is appropriate. Nia studied him carefully. There was no anger in his tone, only the calm focus of someone determined to uncover the truth. Across the table Nathan had now begun stacking the paper coasters into a small tower, while Noah counted how many pieces it would take before the structure fell. Naomi supervised the process with great seriousness. Ethan watched them for a moment before leaning back slightly in his chair. They are very observant, he said quietly. Nia nodded. They ask many questions. Ethan allowed a faint smile. That is a good sign. The sunlight shifted again across the window, casting long reflections along the floor. Outside, another helicopter passed above the river, its distant hum barely audible through the glass. Naomi immediately looked up. Another one, she whispered excitedly. Noah rushed back toward the window while Nathan followed close behind. Their laughter filled the room once again as they resumed their mission of watching the sky. Ethan Whitmore stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the glass beside them. He did not say anything this time. Instead, he simply stood there quietly, observing the same skyline they were studying so carefully. The city stretched endlessly beyond the window, a reminder of how large the world could feel and how small the moments within it sometimes appeared. Yet in that moment, standing beside 3 curious children who were learning to count helicopters above the Hudson River, Ethan realized that the future he had spent years building might now include something far more important than any business success he had ever achieved. And for the first time since the morning began, that realization did not feel overwhelming. It felt right. The helicopter that crossed the skyline slowly disappeared beyond the line of buildings along the Hudson River, and the soft hum of its blades faded into the quiet rhythm of the city. Noah pressed both hands against the glass again, as if hoping another one might appear immediately, while Naomi leaned close beside him with the patient seriousness of someone determined not to miss even a single detail of the sky. Nathan stood slightly behind them, watching the river instead, his calm eyes following the long white trail of a ferry cutting through the water far below. Ethan Whitmore remained beside them for a moment longer, letting the silence settle naturally around the simple scene. The conference room that usually hosted complex negotiations now held something far quieter and far more important. For the first time in years, Ethan felt no urgency to return to the schedule waiting upstairs. Naomi suddenly turned toward him again. Do you think there will be more helicopters later? She asked. Ethan considered the question thoughtfully. There usually are, he said. The sky above this city is very busy. Noah looked impressed. Then we should come back and watch again, he declared confidently. Nathan nodded once in agreement. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounds like a good plan. Across the room, Nia Brooks had gathered the children's small jackets from the chairs where they had been placed earlier. The morning had moved quietly toward its natural end, and the routine of the day outside the tower was waiting for them. She walked toward the window where the others stood and gently touched Naomi's shoulder. We should head to daycare soon, she said softly. Naomi nodded, though she gave the skyline one last careful look as if committing the entire view to memory. Noah stepped back from the glass reluctantly, while Nathan quietly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. Ethan watched them as they prepared to leave, aware that the next few minutes carried a quiet significance. The first meeting had happened. The first conversations had begun. But the real work of building trust would happen slowly, outside the walls of this conference room, in small, everyday moments that could not be rushed. Naomi slipped her hand into her mother's while Noah and Nathan stood close beside her. Ethan walked with them toward the door. The hallway outside remained calm, the distant sounds of office activity drifting through the polished corridors. As they reached the doorway, Naomi looked up at Ethan once more. "Will you still watch the helicopters when we leave?" she asked. Ethan nodded gently. "Yes, and I will tell you how many I see when you come back." Naomi seemed satisfied with that promise. Noah gave a small wave. Nathan studied Ethan for a moment before quietly lifting his hand in return. Nia paused beside the doorway, her eyes meeting Ethan's briefly. The understanding between them no longer required long explanations. The first step had been taken carefully and respectfully. The rest would unfold with time. "We will see you next week," she said calmly. Ethan nodded once. "I will be here." The children stepped into the hallway beside their mother, their small voices returning to a quiet discussion about ships and airplanes as they walked toward the elevator. Ethan remained standing in the doorway for several seconds after they disappeared around the corner. The conference room behind him felt strangely different now. The sunlight still crossed the floor, the skyline still stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Yet the space no longer carried the same detached atmosphere it had held earlier that morning. Ethan walked slowly back toward the window and looked out across the city again. The river moved steadily between the buildings, ferries and cargo ships continuing their routes as they had all day. A distant helicopter appeared once more above the skyline, its blades turning steadily as it moved toward the harbor. Ethan followed its path across the sky, remembering Naomi's careful count and Noah's enthusiastic pointing and Nathan's quiet observations. 3 small voices that had suddenly become the most important sound in his day. For years he had measured success through numbers and growth charts displayed across boardroom screens. Yet standing there now, he understood that the future unfolding ahead of him would be measured differently. It would be measured in visits to daycare, in afternoons spent explaining how helicopters stay in the air, in the patient process of earning the trust of 3 children who had already learned how to watch the world together. The helicopter moved farther away until it became only a small shape against the blue sky. Ethan Whitmore remained at the window for a moment longer before finally turning back toward the conference table where the folded letter still rested. He picked it up carefully, smoothing the edges as if acknowledging the quiet message that had waited 3 years to reach him. Then he placed the letter inside his folder and walked toward the door. The hallway beyond was filled with the familiar rhythm of the company he had built, but something within that rhythm had changed. For the first time since the morning began, Ethan Whitmore knew exactly where he needed to be when the next helicopter crossed the skyline.